Well, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the first half of Chapter 2 of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. In previous videos, we've looked at, obviously, provided an introduction, the prologue, in Chapter 1. And so in this chapter, which follows immediately after the chapter with the Battle Royale, Ellison must have been thinking to himself, well, how do I possibly top that? In fact, in some of his writings, he worries about, as he's writing this novel, he worries about the only thing people are going to like in the book, the only thing people are going to remember are the incidents from Chapter 1. So we know that he was interested in, he was worried about, had he already started his book at such a climactic point that everything after that would be disappointing. And so in Chapter 2, he goes, it looks like a deliberate attempt to make something that is even more sensational than the things that happened even in the first chapter. So we can, and it starts out simply enough, right? We are now at the college, and very much like when we were reading Jane Eyre, we see this kind of journey that the narrator is on. We see him relatively young as a young boy, and now he's already left his hometown behind him and is in his college years. And so and he describes the college as this kind of ideal place. Everything about it is beautiful. The lawns are manicured, the flowers are in bloom, all the buildings are immaculate. And so it seems, in the way he describes it, as a kind of Eden-esque place. And one of the things that I want to focus on in this video is the use of symbolism in Invisible Man. And I think I want to start that by talking about figuring out how you know when an author is being symbolic at all. And essentially there are three ways. One, if you see an author making an association between a thing and an idea that thing might represent or connote, and he does this repeatedly, well then perhaps you're looking at something that the author is drawing your attention to and wants you to see as a symbol. So for example, if a cloud is hanging over someone's head, and it happens just once, you might say, well, that's simply scene setting, and so it doesn't necessarily mean anything in particular. But if that cloud keeps reappearing at particular times when a character is feeling a particular way, then you begin to think the author is drawing your attention to something and he's speaking metaphorically or symbolically. So one way to tell if an author is being symbolic is if you see an image repeated over and over again. A second way to tell if an author is being symbolic is if he uses an image in an unusual way. So for example, let's say the cloud is hanging only over one person's head. Well, clearly clouds don't do that, and so in an instance like that, the sense is that the author is trying to do, because the author is adapting reality, that he's trying to make a particular point. And then the third, and perhaps the easiest way to tell when an author is being symbolic is when he tells you he is being symbolic. And so that's what Ellison has been doing several times, right? Even from the very beginning in the prologue, when the briefcase in the narrator's dream is filled with envelopes, one inside another, and his grandfather says those envelopes represent years. Well, clearly envelopes only represent years on a symbolic level, not on a literal level. So even from the very beginning, Ellison is indicating to us that he speaks metaphorically. He speaks in images and symbols. And so we see a profusion of those in Chapter 2 in the beginning, and so it makes sense for us to kind of pay attention to kind of not catalog them so much as just recognize what these various symbols are, why they appear, what he means for that. And any good writer, and Ellison certainly is one, is only going to use these various effects, like symbolism, in an effort to reinforce the themes that he's making. So one of the big symbols that we see, for example, is this campus, which is so Eden-esque. And because we have been trained in reading narratives to know that one can't stay in an Eden, but one ultimately gets kicked out. Here we are, when we see a character, especially early in the book, in a state of grace, in an Eden-esque environment, we can be pretty sure that that character is not going to be there for very long. We saw that in Candide at the very beginning when he's kicked out of the palace of the Baron. So here, among the symbols that we see is the symbol of the founder himself, a character who is based on Booker T. Washington. And the statue of Booker T. Washington, or the statue of the founder of the college that he goes to, has this large African-American man bending down and lifting a veil the veil of ignorance from over the head of a slave who is kneeling before him. And as the narrator looks at that statue, he questions the accepted meaning of that, the lifting of the veil, and he wonders if instead of lifting the veil of ignorance, is really what the founder is doing is lowering the veil over the young African American in order to keep that person in a state of ignorance. And so, because a statue obviously is static, it's hard to tell which direction that veil is going. Is it being lifted or is it being lowered? So there too is a symbol. And in case you missed the point, almost immediately after, he has a bunch of birds defecating on the statue in order to kind of suggest a certain contempt for the accepted interpretation, the accepted version of that statue. And so that's one of the larger symbols that we see in this chapter, one of the more important ones. And it gets, I think, to the heart of what it is that Ellison is getting at in this book, which is this sense of self-discovery, the ability to see. And so it's no surprise that important symbols like that reinforce that meaning. In the beginning of this chapter, the narrator is given the task of being a chauffeur to one of the founders, one of the rich white men who have come down each spring to and bask in their creation and to spread their largesse. Mr. Norton, the founder, the particular founder here, has an interesting association with the college. He got interested in the college, perhaps in part because, as he tells the narrator as he's being driven around, he wanted to do something meaningful with his life after his daughter died. And you can tell from this discussion how much he really loved his daughter. Went on I don't know where the mother was. One presumes that she has died also. And so the father has taken the daughter on a European tour, and during that trip, she gets ill and then dies. And the father, in his devastation, looking for meaning in his life, has decided that he's going to find that in the promotion of this college and in the lifting up of African Americans. And so, in a way, that's very noble, but in another way, it also is, it is somewhat condescending, because he talks about the narrator as a kind of cog, and it's hard to think of a more dehumanizing image than to have a human being reduced to a thing, and that thing in particular being the least important part of a machine, a cog that is the cheapest, most easily replaceable part. And so on the one hand, noble, on the other hand, a little bit condescending. And it's at this time during the drive that the narrator, in driving, has left the limits of the college. Mr. Norton himself says he's quite familiar with the college and wants to have a new experience, wants to see something new, and so asks the narrator to indulge himself and drive beyond the limits of the college. And as soon as he does, you realize that the environment surrounding the college, the environs, are very dilapidated. So in contrast to the ideal surrounding of the college, you have the wasteland that surrounds it. And so instead of relatively affluent upwardly mobile African Americans in the college, it's surrounded by sharecroppers, the descendants of slaves, eking out a subsistence existence as best they can. And it is at this point that they come across a sharecropper who has notoriously impregnated his own daughter. And so here you have a really very fascinating juxtaposition of Mr. Norton and his love for his daughter, juxtaposed with the sharecropper who has impregnated his own daughter. And Mr. Norton is very, it's hard to say exactly what his reaction is, but it is a very strong one. He has a very difficult time explaining what it is that he's feeling, and so as a result, he wants to interrogate, he wants to understand from this father how it came to be that he impregnated his own daughter. He even says, somewhat oddly and cryptically, you've looked into the abyss and survived. How is that possible? And one begins to wonder about the founder and his feelings for his own daughter, because it seems that the reaction here, his feelings about this, aren't simply disgust, but also fascination. And so we're going to see in the second half of the chapter exactly how that came to happen. and it is a moment of no small interest to Mr. Norton. But in addition to that, you have a variety of other things going on in this chapter. We do get to see Ralph Waldo Emerson's name mentioned here, although not so much in precisely, not precisely what it is that he's teaching, but we touched on that last time. And so the idea of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Booker T. Washington and these notions that they had of being self-reliant and lifting oneself up. And this is very much part of the early teaching in the South in the post, in the kind of like post-Reconstruction era, where the idea was for now that African Americans have been freed, it is up to them to develop their own culture and to take care of themselves. At the same time, however, we hear this notion of the white man's burden. And that refers to this idea of now that African Americans have been freed, are white people really free to let them sink or swim on their own, or do we have some enduring responsibility since we've kept them deprived for so long of education and opportunity? And so, do we, is there this burden that exists or not? And this is one of the ideas that that is being touched upon here. So they and when they are confronting the father with his family, you can see the narrator himself has the same this kind of same attraction and repulsion, and so one wonders when the narrator has taken Mr. Norton on a drive, has he taken the founder to this area in hopes of meeting this father and this family, or was that accidental? Is he being subversive like his grandfather advised him to be, and as he later recognizes he is himself in the prologue, or was this purely an accident? Is this one step on the road to his becoming subversive? And it's left a little unclear, and for us to kind of figure out. But as you're thinking about as we're thinking about symbols in this chapter and in this in this book generally, there are all sorts of examples that you can find. Looking on page 44, for example, of again the 1982 issue publication, they're driving along, and just as the founder is talking about the fate that the narrator might have, what his his future is limitless, and at exactly that point as they're driving along, that an insect gets crushed against the windshield of the car, and so is that merely the sort of thing that happened while people are driving on a highway, or since it happens right at that moment, is the idea that once again this is a symbol, and you can find other examples of that.